The wind howled like a beast, tearing through the frozen forest with a relentless fury. Ryan was halfway through bolting the door when he heard it. A faint scratch, followed by a whimper so fragile it barely pierced the storm's roar. He froze, heart pounding, as he turned toward the sound. What he saw on his porch would haunt him forever. A gaunt, frost-covered dog, dragging her body forward, a tattered blanket tied around her neck. Nestled within the blanket, two tiny pups shivered against the cold. Ryan thought he had seen it all during his years as an EMT. But nothing could prepare him for what came next. The sight rooted Ryan to the floor, his breath catching in his throat as the blizzard howled around him. The dog, a German shepherd with sunken eyes and ribs visible beneath her frost-covered fur, locked her gaze onto his. It wasn't just desperation, it was a silent plea, raw and unyielding. Her legs trembled violently as she tried to shield the bundle tied around her neck. A tattered blanket barely concealing two tiny pups whose faint whimpers mingled with the wind. Ryan's instincts screamed at him to act, but his body hesitated, the weight of indecision holding him in place. He had been through countless emergencies, crashes, fires, and moments where split seconds determined life or death. But this was something different, something personal. The storm slammed against the cabin again, icy tendrils creeping through the cracks in the door. Ryan snapped out of his trance. "Damn it," he muttered, throwing the bolt aside and wrenching the door open. The cold hit him like a hammer, stealing the breath from his lungs. "Come on, girl," he called out, crouching low and extending his hand. "Let's get you out of this." The shepherd hesitated, her body swaying as she tried to step forward. She nudged the pups with her nose, encouraging them to move. The larger of the two pups stumbled through the snow, its tiny legs barely supporting it, while the smaller one remained curled in the blanket. Motionless, the shepherd whined, her eyes darting from the pups to Ryan. "Okay," Ryan said softly, edging closer. "You're not going to make it out here. Let me help." Reaching into the storm, he grabbed the blanket's edge, pulling the tiny family toward the doorway. The shepherd growled faintly, a weak but instinctive warning. But she didn't resist. As soon as they crossed the threshold, Ryan kicked the door shut behind them, shutting out the storm's fury. Inside, the sudden warmth caused the shepherd to collapse onto the floor, her pups pressing tightly against her side. She shuddered uncontrollably, her body caught between exhaustion and the shock of the temperature shift. Ryan quickly grabbed an old quilt from the couch and wrapped it around them. The pups barely stirred, their fragile bodies too cold to move. Ryan's EMT training kicked in. He rushed to the kitchen, grabbed a heating pad, and placed it under the blanket, careful to avoid overwhelming their tiny forms. He poured warm water into a bowl and placed it near the shepherd. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" Ryan murmured, his voice low, more to himself than to her. The dog lifted her head weakly, her eyes never leaving his face. For a moment, Ryan swore he saw gratitude there, mixed with exhaustion, fear, and a lingering distrust. The smaller pup let out a faint, wheezing gasp, and Ryan's heart lurched. He leaned down, his fingers trembling as he checked its pulse. It was weak, too weak. "No, no, no," he muttered, cradling the tiny body in his hands. He rubbed its chest gently, trying to stimulate its breathing. The shepherd whined softly, watching him with a mixture of hope and fear. Ryan felt the weight of her trust, a silent demand not to fail her. "Stay with me, little one," he whispered, performing delicate compressions. Seconds felt like hours, and just as he feared the worst, the pup let out a faint cough. Relief washed over Ryan as he placed the pup back against its mother. "Strong little fighters," he said, glancing at the shepherd. "Just like you." The dog let out a low sigh, her body relaxing slightly as she curled around her pups. Ryan sat back, his chest heaving. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: purpose. But as he looked at the fragile family now depending on him, one question lingered in his mind. What the hell happens next? Ryan sat on the floor next to the small family, his thoughts racing as the storm roared outside, rattling the windows with its fury. The German shepherd, who had barely managed to make it to his porch alive, now lay curled protectively around her pups, her body trembling with exhaustion. The firelight danced across the room, casting warm hues over the scene. But Ryan knew that warmth alone wouldn't be enough to pull them through the night. He grabbed his phone, scrolling through his emergency contacts, but quickly realized that the storm had taken down the signal. No calls, no help, he was entirely on his own. The weight of the responsibility pressed heavily on his chest. He glanced over at the shepherd. Her weary eyes locked onto his as though she understood the stakes as well as he did. You really know how to pick your battles. Ha! He muttered, attempting a weak smile. The dog let out a faint huff of air, resting her head against the blanket. Ryan took it as a sign of trust. Fragile though it was, he got to work, rummaging through his supplies. His EMT instincts kicked in, guiding his actions like muscle memory. He boiled water for a makeshift heating bottle and warmed a can of chicken broth, pouring it carefully into a shallow dish. Bringing it over, he placed the dish just close enough for the shepherd to reach. She sniffed it cautiously before lapping at it, her movements slow and deliberate. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give her strength and a little hope. Ryan then turned his attention to the pups. The smaller one, the one that had nearly stopped breathing earlier, still looked frail. His tiny chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, each one an effort. He wrapped the heating pad snugly around it, making sure it wasn't too hot, then placed it directly against the shepherd's side, letting her warmth do the rest. The larger pup stirred and let out a soft, high-pitched squeak, pawing feebly at its sibling. Ryan couldn't help but smile at the sight, a small flicker of life amidst so much adversity. You've got a fighter on your hands, he said softly to the shepherd. Her ears twitched, and her tail gave a faint wag, her first sign of hope. Before I share more about this incredible story and the decisions that changed everything for this family, I want to connect with all of you watching. Where are you tuning in from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. I'd love to know where this story is being heard. Ryan leaned back against the couch, his exhaustion finally catching up with him. He ran a hand through his hair, glancing toward the frosted window where the storm continued its relentless assault. The fire crackled, filling the room with a comforting warmth. But it didn't quiet the questions racing through his mind. Who were they? Where had they come from? And why had she, this battered, frostbitten shepherd, chosen his cabin out of all the places in the wilderness? The tag on her collar caught his eye. It was worn and scratched, but he could make out a single word engraved on the metal: Maple. So you've got a name, Ryan said, his voice soft. Maple's ears perked up at the sound, and for the first time, her tired eyes seemed to hold a flicker of recognition. All right, Maple, Ryan continued, leaning forward. I don't know what you've been through, but you're safe now. I promise. The words felt heavy, not because he didn't mean them, but because he knew how much was riding on that promise. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and Maple and her pups were far from out of danger. As the hours ticked by, Ryan remained by their side, tending to the fire and checking on the pups. Every so often, Maple would lift her head to watch him, her expression softening little by little. It was as if she was beginning to trust that, for the first time in a long time, someone cared enough to stay. Outside, the storm howled on, but inside the cabin, a fragile bond was forming, one built on survival, trust, and the unspoken understanding that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can rewrite an entire story. As the storm raged on into the night, Ryan found himself unable to tear his eyes away from Maple and her pups. There was a fragility to them that struck a deep chord in him, something that made him feel both protective and painfully aware of how much they relied on him now. He adjusted the heating pad under the smaller pup, whose breathing had steadied but was still shallow, and then turned his attention back to Maple. Her eyes, though heavy with exhaustion, followed his every move. There was an intelligence in them, a quiet strength that seemed to say, "I fought too hard to give up now." Ryan felt a lump rise in his throat. He didn't know what this dog had endured, but he could tell she had faced the worst of the world and still carried on. For her pups, if not for herself. The storm outside battered the cabin relentlessly, but within its walls, a fragile calm had settled. Ryan stoked the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows across the room. The warmth began to fill the space, driving away the icy bite that clung to his skin. He could see Maple's body relaxing ever so slightly, her protective stance softening as she seemed to accept that, at least for now, they were safe. Still, questions gnawed at him. Where had she come from? How far had she traveled through the storm? And why? The blanket tied around her neck wasn't the kind of thing that would just appear by chance. Someone had tried to care for her. Someone who had tied her pups to her with the hope that they'd stay together. But where were they now? Had they abandoned her? Or had they been lost to the very storm that had driven her to his door? Ryan shook his head, pushing the thoughts aside. There was no use speculating. Not while there was work to be done. He rummaged through his cabinets, pulling out an old first aid kit. His years as an EMT had taught him how to patch up wounds. But nothing could prepare him for tending to an injured dog. Maple's paws were raw, cracked from the cold and the jagged terrain she must have crossed. Gently, he cleaned them, his hands steady despite the growl she gave in protest. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his voice soothing. "I'm not here to hurt you. Just let me help." Maple's growl softened into a low whine, but she didn't pull away. It was trust, not complete, but enough for now. The hours passed in a blur of small tasks and quiet moments. Ryan couldn't stop himself from marveling at Maple's resilience. Despite everything, she never stopped checking on her pups, nudging them closer to her body and licking their tiny faces to keep them warm. It was a quiet, instinctual devotion, and it stirred something deep within him. For the first time in years, Ryan allowed himself to think about the life he'd left behind, the rescue missions, the people he'd helped, and the ones he couldn't. He had walked away from it all, convinced that the weight of failure was too much to bear. Yet here he was, fighting to save a family that had stumbled into his life by chance. Or was it chance at all? As dawn approached, the storm began to subside. The wind, once ferocious, quieted to a mournful whisper. Pale light seeped through the frosted windows, casting a soft glow over the cabin. Ryan sat back, his body aching from hours of vigilance, but his heart felt lighter than it had in years. Maple stirred, lifting her head to peer at him. Her gaze was softer now, less guarded. Ryan reached out tentatively, his hand hovering near her muzzle. For a moment, she hesitated, but then, to his surprise, she pressed her nose into his palm. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. "You're a fighter," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "All three of you are." As he sat there, feeling the warmth of Maple's breath against his hand, a thought crossed his mind. What if they were meant to find him? What if this was his second chance, not just to save them, but to save himself? But with the storm fading, Ryan knew the real challenges were just beginning. The pups were still fragile, and Maple needed more care than he could provide here in the isolation of his cabin. The question now was how far he was willing to go to ensure their survival. The silence after the storm was almost unnerving, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire and the faint whimpers of the pups. Ryan sat by the window, staring out at the endless white expanse. The world looked peaceful, but he knew the calm was deceptive. The temperature outside was still deadly, and the roads would be impassable for days. He turned back to the family now dozing near the fire. Maple had curled herself tightly around the pups, her body a barrier between them and the world. Her head rested on the blanket, but her eyes fluttered open whenever one of the pups shifted. Even in sleep, she was vigilant, Ryan couldn't help but feel a swell of admiration for her. In her own way, she reminded him of the firemen and EMTs he had worked with, fighting against impossible odds, refusing to give in, no matter the cost. Ryan knelt beside her, his voice low. "I don't know what brought you here, but you've got more fight in you than most people I've met." Maple lifted her head slightly, her tired eyes meeting his. He hesitated, then reached out to gently stroke her head. She didn't flinch this time, and for a moment, she closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. It was the first sign of true trust, and it hit Ryan harder than he expected. The pups stirred, their tiny bodies pressing closer to Maple's warmth. The smaller one, the one that had nearly died in his hands, let out a soft squeak, its fragile legs kicking against the blanket. Ryan smiled despite himself. "Tough little guy," he murmured. "Just like your mom." But as much as he wanted to savor the moment, reality weighed heavily on him. Maple and the pups couldn't stay here. The cabin was a temporary refuge, not a solution. They needed proper food, medical attention, and a safe place to recover. Ryan had enough supplies to get them through another day, maybe two. But after that, he didn't want to think about it. Standing, he grabbed his coat and opened the door just enough to peer outside. The storm had left behind a world buried in snow, the drifts high enough to block his truck. The idea of trekking to town on foot with Maple and the pups seemed impossible. But what other choice did he have? Ryan closed the door and leaned against it, his mind racing. He was used to making life-and-death decisions. But this felt different. This wasn't just about survival, it was about doing what was right. And doing what was right often came at a cost. "All right," he said aloud, his voice breaking the quiet. Maple's ears perked up at the sound. Ryan looked at her, his resolve hardening. "We'll figure this out. I promise." He spent the next few hours preparing. He wrapped the pups in additional blankets, making sure they were secure and warm. For Maple, he fashioned a harness from an old belt and rope, something he could use to help guide her through the snow. The plan was risky, but he couldn't ignore the gnawing certainty that staying here would only delay the inevitable. As the sun began its slow descent, casting a golden light over the snow, Ryan knelt in front of Maple. "It's not going to be easy," he said, his voice soft. "But I think you already know that, don't you?" Maple's gaze was steady, as though she understood every word. She stood slowly, her body still weak but her determination clear. The pups let out soft cries as Ryan carefully placed them into a makeshift carrier he had fashioned from an old backpack. He secured them snugly, ensuring they were protected from the biting cold. Before stepping outside, Ryan paused, one hand resting on the doorframe. He looked back at the cabin, a place that had been his retreat from the world, a shelter from his own pain. Now, it had become something else entirely. The starting point for a journey he hadn't planned but couldn't turn away from. As they stepped into the snow, the cold immediately stole his breath. But he didn't falter. Maple followed close beside him, her steps slow but steady. The pups remained silent, their small forms bundled tightly against his back. Ryan tightened his grip on Maple's makeshift harness, guiding her through the deep drifts. Every step was a battle, the snow pulling at his legs and the wind biting through his coat. But with each step forward, Ryan felt something he hadn't in years: purpose. For the first time since leaving the life he once knew, he wasn't running from his failures. He was moving toward something that mattered. The cabin disappeared behind them, swallowed by the white expanse. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but Ryan's determination burned brighter than the fire that had kept them warm. As they trudged forward, a single thought echoed in his mind. Could this journey not only save them, but also finally save him? The journey through the snow was grueling. Each step felt like a battle against nature itself, the drifts reaching up to Ryan's knees and the biting wind cutting through his coat. Maple trudged beside him, her breaths labored but steady, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. The pups remained quiet in the makeshift carrier strapped to Ryan's back, their tiny bodies nestled tightly together for warmth. The sun, though weak, began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the endless white landscape. Ryan pressed forward, his mind focused on reaching the main road. If he could just make it there, someone might pass by, a plow, a truck, anyone who could help get them to safety. His legs ached, his lungs burned, but every time he glanced at Maple, he found the strength to keep going. She was slowing now, her steps faltering. Ryan stopped, crouching down to check on her. Her paws, still raw despite his earlier efforts, were leaving faint smudges of blood in the snow. He cursed under his breath, guilt gnawing at him for pushing her so hard. "We'll rest," he said softly, stroking her head. "Just a few minutes, all right?" Maple lowered herself onto the snow with a heavy sigh, her body curling protectively around the pups as Ryan gently placed the carrier beside her. He knelt down and opened his pack, pulling out a small thermos of warm water, pouring some into a collapsible bowl. He held it out to her. She drank slowly, her eyes never leaving his face, as though silently assuring him she could go on. But Ryan wasn't so sure. The exhaustion in her eyes was evident, and he knew the cold was taking its toll on her. He glanced down at the pups, their tiny bodies stirring slightly within the blanket. They were alive, but barely. They needed warmth, proper care, and food, things he couldn't give them out here. Looking around, Ryan scanned the horizon for any sign of shelter or help. The landscape was bleak, just endless snow and barren trees. His heart sank as he realized how far they still had to go. The road felt impossibly distant, and the weight of the journey ahead pressed heavily on his shoulders. But turning back wasn't an option. He had made a promise, and he wasn't about to break it. "All right," he said, more to himself than to Maple. "Let's move." He lifted the pups back into the carrier and adjusted the straps. Then he crouched beside Maple, gently urging her to her feet. She groaned softly but obeyed, her determination mirroring his own. Together, they pressed on, the wind howling in their ears and the snow crunching beneath their feet. As the sky darkened, Ryan's resolve began to waver. His body was screaming for rest, and every step felt heavier than the last. But just as he was about to give in to despair, he spotted something in the distance, a faint glow breaking through the shadows. A light. It was far off, barely visible through the swirling snow, but it was there. "Do you see that, girl?" he asked, his voice hoarse with hope. Maple lifted her head, her ears twitching as if she, too, sensed the promise of safety ahead. The sight of the light gave Ryan a renewed sense of purpose. Gritting his teeth, he pushed forward, each step bringing them closer. As they neared, the glow sharpened into the shape of a small farmhouse, its windows illuminated by the warm, golden light of a fire. Smoke curled from the chimney, a beacon of life in the midst of the desolation. Reaching the porch, Ryan pounded on the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Hello?" he called, his voice cracking with desperation. "Please, I need help." The door creaked open, revealing an older man bundled in a thick sweater, his face etched with surprise and concern. "What in God's name?" the man began, his eyes widening as he took in the sight of Ryan, Maple, and the bundled pups. "Please," Ryan said, his voice breaking. "They're freezing. They won't make it much longer." The man didn't hesitate. "Get them inside," he said, stepping aside to let them in. The warmth of the farmhouse enveloped them as Ryan carried the pups inside, gently placing the carrier on a worn rug near the fire. Maple followed, collapsing onto the rug with a deep sigh, her body trembling from the sudden temperature shift. The man grabbed blankets and draped them over her, his hands moving with practiced care. "My name's Henry," the man said, his voice kind but firm. "You've brought them here just in time. Let's see what we can do." Ryan nodded, unable to find the words to express his gratitude. He knelt beside Maple, stroking her head as Henry fetched supplies. The pups stirred in their blanket, their tiny cries breaking the silence. For the first time in hours, Ryan felt a glimmer of hope. They weren't safe yet, but they were closer than they'd ever been. And for now, that was enough. Henry worked swiftly, his movements precise and calm as he brought over a small box of medical supplies. His hands, though aged, showed the steady confidence of someone who had done this kind of work before. Ryan watched in silence, his exhaustion momentarily replaced by curiosity and a glimmer of hope. "Let's take a look at these little ones," Henry murmured, kneeling beside the pups. He gently unwrapped the blankets and examined each tiny body, his brow furrowing. Malnourished, but their breathing steady. "This 1 inch," he pointed to the smaller pup, "is a fighter, but we'll need to keep a close eye. He's weaker than the other." Ryan nodded, his voice catching in his throat. "I thought I lost him earlier. Managed to bring him back, but just barely." Henry glanced up, his expression softening. "You did good, son. Getting them this far wasn't easy, I can tell." As Henry worked on cleaning Maple's paws and applying a salve to her cracked pads, Ryan knelt by her head, her eyes fluttered open, meeting his with a quiet weariness. She didn't flinch or growl this time, instead letting out a long, low sigh. Ryan reached out, his hand resting gently on her head. "You're safe now," he whispered. "I promise." Henry stood, wiping his hands on a towel. "She's strong, but she's been through hell. You'll need to keep her off her feet for a bit. Let her heal. And those pups, they need warmth and proper feeding." Ryan glanced at the fire, where the pups were now nestled in a soft pile of blankets. Their tiny chests rose and fell steadily, and for the first time since this ordeal began, he allowed himself to feel a sliver of relief. "You've done this before, haven't you?" Ryan asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. Henry chuckled softly, his eyes glinting with nostalgia. "Used to run a small rescue for strays. Years ago, lost my wife, though, and, well, the place fell quiet. Haven't had a reason to keep it going until now." Ryan hesitated, his gaze shifting back to Maple and her pups. "You think you can help them? I mean, really help them? Because I don't know if I can. I did what I could." "But," Henry cut him off with a firm hand on his shoulder. "You've already done more than most would. But yeah, I can help. You're not alone in this anymore." Those words hit Ryan harder than he expected. For so long, he had been running from the world, carrying the weight of his past alone. To hear someone say he didn't have to do this on his own, it was like a crack of sunlight piercing through heavy clouds. As the night wore on, Henry prepared warm milk for the pups, using an old dropper to feed the smaller one. Ryan helped where he could, though exhaustion tugged at his body. Maple, now cleaned and bandaged, watched the process intently, her ears twitching every time one of her pups made a sound. "You've got yourself a good dog here," Henry said, nodding toward Maple. "She's got the heart of a warrior. You can see it in her eyes." Ryan smiled faintly, brushing a hand over his face. "Yeah, she's incredible. I don't know how she made it this far." "She made it because she had to," Henry replied simply. "For them." Ryan's gaze shifted to the pups, now asleep in the warmth of the firelight. The weight of Henry's words settled in his chest. Maple hadn't given up, not for a second, because she believed in something bigger than herself. And as much as Ryan had fought to keep his distance from the world, he couldn't ignore how deeply he admired her for it. Henry poured 2 mugs of coffee and handed one to Ryan, who accepted it gratefully. The 2 men sat in companionable silence for a while, the crackle of the fire filling the room. "Got a question for you," Henry said eventually, breaking the quiet. "What's your plan now? Because these dogs, they're gonna need a home." Ryan hesitated, his fingers tightening around the mug. He hadn't thought that far ahead. He'd been so focused on keeping them alive that the idea of what came next felt overwhelming. "I don't know," he admitted. "I mean, I've been on my own for so long. I wouldn't even know where to start." Henry chuckled. "Funny thing about life, you don't need to have all the answers right away. Sometimes, you just take the next step and see where it leads." Ryan looked at Maple, her head resting on her paws as she watched her pups sleep. He thought about the journey they'd endured, the bond they'd built in such a short time. Maybe Henry was right. Maybe this was just the beginning of something he didn't need to figure out all at once. For now, they were safe. For now, that was enough. But as Ryan leaned back in his chair, his thoughts drifted to the future. Could he really give Maple and her pups the life they deserved? Or was there another chapter waiting for all of them? One he hadn't yet imagined? Ryan woke to the soft hum of voices and the warmth of the fire still crackling in the hearth. The faint light of dawn filtered through the frosted windows, painting the room in shades of gold and gray. Maple was lying beside him, her head resting on his knee, her breathing calm and steady. The pups stirred gently in their blanket nest, their tiny bodies finally free of the shivering that had racked them the night before. Across the room, Henry stood by the kitchen counter, quietly brewing coffee. The smell drifted through the air, blending with the comforting warmth of the fire. For a moment, Ryan felt an unfamiliar sense of peace, a fragile, tentative feeling that he wasn't ready to trust yet. "Morning," Henry said, his voice low so as not to disturb the dogs. "You're not much of a sleeper, are you?" Ryan smiled faintly, running a hand through his hair. "Not anymore." Henry nodded, handing him a steaming mug. "You've been through some storms of your own. I can see it." Ryan didn't answer. He didn't need to. Instead, he looked down at Maple, who had shifted her head to rest on his boot. She was watching him with those soulful eyes, filled with a quiet resilience that seemed to mirror his own. "So," Henry said after a moment, sitting across from him, "what's next?" Ryan exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting to the pups. Their tiny chests rose and fell in perfect rhythm, a fragile reminder of the life he had fought to save. "I don't know," he admitted. "I wasn't planning on any of this. I came up here to get away from, well, everything." "And now?" Henry asked, his tone gentle but probing. Ryan hesitated. "Now, I can't just leave them, but I don't know if I can give them what they need." Henry sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "You're not alone in this. You know, whatever you decide, I'll help. But it seems to me they've already chosen you." Ryan looked down at Maple again, and for the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility. Maybe this wasn't just about saving them. Maybe they were here to save him, too. By midday, Ryan and Henry had loaded the pups and Maple into Henry's old truck. The snowplow had finally cleared a narrow path down the mountain, and the roads, though treacherous, were passable. Henry drove carefully, his hands steady on the wheel, while Ryan sat in the passenger seat. Maple curled up at his feet. The drive to town was quiet, the only sound the occasional soft whimper from the pups. Ryan found himself glancing down at Maple every few minutes, his hand resting lightly on her head. She seemed calmer now, her trust in him solidifying with each passing hour. When they reached the small veterinary clinic, a kind-faced woman in scrubs greeted them at the door. "Oh, you poor things," she murmured, her eyes filling with concern as she took in Maple's condition and the frail state of the pups. The next hour passed in a blur of examinations and gentle care. The veterinarian confirmed what Ryan had already suspected. Maple and her pups were malnourished and exhausted but otherwise healthy. With proper rest and care, they would recover fully. As the veterinarian worked, Ryan sat quietly in the corner, his thoughts churning. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than a chance encounter. Maple had chosen his cabin in the storm, against all odds. She had trusted him when she had every reason not to. And now, as he watched her lying protectively beside her pups, he realized he couldn't walk away from them. When the vet finished, she handed Ryan a list of supplies and instructions for Maple's care. "They'll need a lot of attention," she said, "but something tells me they're in good hands." Ryan nodded, his decision made. "Thanks." Document. The drive back to the cabin felt different. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crisp, clear sky and a landscape glistening with untouched snow. The air was still bitterly cold, but the sun shone brightly, casting a warmth that felt almost symbolic. Ryan carried Maple and the pups inside, settling them near the fire. This time, though, it didn't feel like a temporary refuge. The cabin, once a place of isolation, now felt like something else entirely, a home. Over the next few weeks, life settled into a new rhythm. Maple grew stronger with each passing day, her coat regaining its luster and her eyes their sharp intelligence. The pups thrived under Ryan's care, their tiny bodies growing plump and lively. They tumbled across the cabin floor, their playful yips filling the space with a joy Ryan hadn't realized he'd been missing. Henry visited often, bringing supplies and a steady presence that Ryan had come to value. The older man had become more than a mentor, he was a friend, someone who understood the weight of Ryan's past without judgment. One evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth and the pups dozed in a heap by Maple's side, Ryan sat at the worn wooden table, a notebook open in front of him. For the first time in years, he picked up a pen and began to write. He wrote about the storm, about Maple's unyielding courage, and about the quiet strength he had found within himself through her. As he wrote, Maple padded over to him, her nose nudging his hand. He smiled, scratching behind her ears. "I guess we're stuck with each other." "Ha!" She wagged her tail softly, her eyes filled with a trust that made his chest ache. For the first time in years, Ryan felt whole, not because the pain of his past had disappeared, but because he had found something worth fighting for again. Thank you for following along with this heartfelt story. What are your thoughts on Ryan, Maple, and the pup's journey? Let us know in the comments. Drop a 2 if you found the story inspiring and well written, or a 7 if you think it could use some improvement. We'd love to hear your feedback. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to Tapestry of Worlds for more captivating and meaningful tales. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Sometimes, a small story can spark a big sense of hope in someone's life. Let's spread these beautiful messages together.